In the marble halls of Renaissance Florence, where whispers could topple governments and a single misstep could spell doom, Niccolò Machiavelli observed the intricate dance of power with the precision of a master strategist. His observations, born from witnessing the rise and fall of princes, the manipulation of masses, and the delicate balance between strength and vulnerability, would echo through centuries as timeless wisdom about human nature and the preservation of one's position in an unforgiving world. The fundamental truth that Machiavelli understood, and which modern individuals must grasp to navigate today's complex social and professional landscapes, is that public perception is reality, and reality shapes destiny. In a world where every action is scrutinized, every word is recorded, and every weakness is exploited, the ancient principles of strategic self-presentation have never been more relevant. Consider the ambitious executive who breaks down in tears during a board meeting, revealing personal struggles that, while human and understandable, immediately shift the perception of colleagues from respect to pity. Or the politician who shows indecision in a moment of crisis, allowing opponents to frame them as weak and unfit for leadership. These scenarios illustrate the harsh reality that Machiavelli observed centuries ago. In public arenas, weakness is not just a personal failing, it becomes a weapon that others will inevitably use against you. The concept of destroying one's weak self is not about eliminating human emotions or becoming a cold, calculating automaton. Rather, it represents the conscious decision to master one's public persona, to present strength even in moments of internal uncertainty, and to understand that true power comes not from the absence of weakness, but from the disciplined management of how that weakness is perceived and presented to the world. The first cardinal sin: never show your vulnerabilities openly. The marketplace buzzed with activity as merchants hawked their wares, but all eyes were on the young nobleman who had just received devastating news about his family's financial ruin. His face crumpled, tears flowing freely as he processed the information that would change his life forever. Within hours, creditors who had previously shown respect began circling like vultures, rivals who had feared his family's influence started making bold moves against their interests, and allies quietly distanced themselves from what they now perceived as a sinking ship. This scene, repeated countless times throughout history in various forms, illustrates Machiavelli's first and, perhaps most crucial warning: never show your vulnerabilities openly in public spaces. The moment you reveal your soft underbelly, you transform yourself from a player in the game of power into prey for those who are still playing. Vulnerability, while often celebrated in modern discourse as authenticity and emotional intelligence, becomes a double-edged sword in public contexts. When a CEO admits to feeling overwhelmed during a company crisis, the stock price often reflects investors' loss of confidence before the actual fundamentals of the business are even assessed. When a leader confesses to self-doubt during a critical moment, subordinates begin questioning not just the current decision, but every future choice that leader might make. The psychological mechanism behind this response is deeply rooted in human evolutionary patterns. Throughout history, groups have survived by following strong leaders who projected confidence and competence. When a leader shows vulnerability, it triggers an unconscious assessment of whether this person can still provide the security and guidance that the group needs. This assessment happens instantaneously and, often irreversibly, in the public mind. Yet the complete suppression of vulnerability is neither possible nor advisable. The key lies in understanding the distinction between appropriate private sharing and public presentation. Machiavelli himself was not advocating for emotional numbness, but rather for strategic emotional intelligence. A wise leader might share concerns with a trusted advisor in private, process difficult emotions with a mentor or coach away from public view, and then present a composed, confident front when facing the public arena. The modern workplace provides countless examples of this principle in action. The manager who breaks down during a team meeting about budget cuts often finds their authority questioned in subsequent decisions, even when those decisions are sound. The entrepreneur who publicly expresses deep insecurity about their business model may find investors withdrawing support before giving the business model a fair assessment. The professor who openly struggles with imposter syndrome in front of students may discover that their expertise is questioned even in areas where they are genuinely knowledgeable. This doesn't mean presenting a false persona or engaging in deception. Instead, it means understanding that public spaces require a different version of yourself, one that has processed emotions privately and presents conclusions and directions publicly. It means recognizing that your public emotional state becomes information that others use to make judgments about your capabilities, your stability, and your worthiness of trust or support. The art of managing public vulnerability also involves timing and context. A leader who has successfully navigated a crisis might later share some of the internal struggles they faced, but only after demonstrating competence through results. This retrospective vulnerability can actually enhance credibility because it shows both human relatability and the strength to overcome challenges. However, sharing these struggles in real time, while the outcome is still uncertain, often has the opposite effect. The second cardinal sin, never display indecision when others are watching. The council chamber fell silent as all eyes turned to the Duke, waiting for his decision on the trade agreement that would shape their city-state's future for generations. He shifted uncomfortably, glanced around the room seeking approval or guidance from his advisors, and, finally, stammered, "Perhaps we should consider this matter further and reconvene tomorrow." In that moment of visible uncertainty, the Duke's authority began to crumble, and his advisors started planning their own maneuvers for power. Indecision in public is political suicide, whether the politics involve corporate boardrooms, family dynamics, or literal governmental affairs. Machiavelli understood that leadership is as much about appearance as it is about actual decision-making capability, and the appearance of decisiveness often matters more than the perfection of any particular choice. This principle challenges contemporary leadership advice that emphasizes collaborative decision-making and the wisdom of seeking input from multiple stakeholders. While these approaches have merit in private settings, public displays of uncertainty or excessive consultation signal weakness to those who are watching for opportunities to advance their own positions. Consider the startup founder who publicly vacillates between strategic directions during investor presentations. Even if their ultimate decision is sound, the perception of uncertainty can cause investors to question whether this person has the conviction necessary to navigate the inevitable challenges of building a business. Compare this to the founder who has done their deliberation privately and presents a clear, confident direction publicly, even while remaining open to feedback and adjustment behind the scenes. The neuroscience of decision-making reveals why public indecision is so damaging to authority. When people observe someone struggling to make choices, mirror neurons activate the same uncertainty in the observers' minds. This creates a psychological contagion effect where the leader's uncertainty becomes the group's uncertainty about the leader. In contrast, observing confident decision-making activates neural pathways associated with security and trust, even when the observer disagrees with the specific choice being made. Corporate environments provide abundant examples of this dynamic. The executive who openly debates with themselves during a meeting about which direction to take a project often finds their team second-guessing their guidance on everything else. The department head who asks, "What do you think I should do?" rather than "What are your thoughts on this approach I'm considering?" inadvertently signals that they are not fulfilling their role as a decision-maker. The distinction is subtle but crucial. Seeking input demonstrates wisdom and inclusivity. Seeking someone else to make your decisions demonstrates abdication of responsibility. Machiavelli would advocate for gathering information privately, processing options away from public view, and then presenting decisions with confidence while remaining genuinely open to feedback that might improve implementation. This principle extends beyond formal leadership roles into everyday social and professional interactions. The person who cannot decide where to go for dinner when friends are waiting demonstrates the same weakness as the executive who cannot choose a strategic direction. While the stakes differ dramatically, the psychological impact on others' perception of competence and reliability follows similar patterns. The art of decisive public behavior involves several key elements. First, developing the internal capability to make rapid assessments based on available information rather than seeking perfect knowledge before acting. Second, understanding that most decisions can be adjusted as new information becomes available, making the initial choice less critical than the demonstration of decision-making capability. Third, recognizing that explaining your decision-making process is different from exposing your decision-making struggle. Effective leaders learn to say, based on the current information, "Here's the direction we're taking," rather than, "I'm not sure what we should do." They present the reasoning behind their choices without exposing the internal uncertainty that accompanies most significant decisions. They demonstrate confidence in their ability to navigate challenges while maintaining the flexibility to adjust course when necessary. The third cardinal sin: never reveal your true emotions in hostile environments. The ambassador stood before the enemy court, his family held captive in distant lands, his nation's fate hanging on the negotiations that would unfold in the coming days. Inside, his heart raged with fury at the treatment his people had received, terror at what might happen to his loved ones, and desperation to find a solution that would save them all. On his face, however, there was nothing but calm diplomatic composure as he delivered his opening remarks with the steady voice of someone who held all the advantages in the room. Emotional transparency, while valuable in relationships and personal growth, becomes a devastating liability when operating in hostile or competitive environments. Machiavelli observed that showing your true emotions to adversaries is equivalent to handing them a map of your psychological terrain, complete with the best routes to manipulate, pressure, and ultimately defeat you. Modern neuroscience confirms what Machiavelli intuited about emotional display and power dynamics. When we reveal strong emotions, we activate the social cognition networks in observers' brains, allowing them to model our mental state and predict our future behavior. In cooperative environments, this builds empathy and connection. In competitive environments, it provides strategic intelligence that can be weaponized against us. Consider the negotiation table where a buyer desperately wants a particular property but allows their enthusiasm to show clearly to the seller. That visible desire immediately strengthens the seller's position, often resulting in a higher price and worse terms for the buyer. The same dynamic plays out in job interviews where candidates reveal too much about how badly they need the position, in business deals where entrepreneurs show too much attachment to particular outcomes, and in personal relationships where one party reveals significantly more emotional investment than the other. The legal profession provides perhaps the clearest examples of this principle in action. Trial lawyers know that showing anger, frustration, or desperation to a jury can undermine their case, regardless of the merits of their arguments. Prosecutors who appear vindictive rather than professionally committed to justice may generate sympathy for defendants. Defense attorneys who seem overly emotional about their client's fate may cause jurors to question their objectivity and professional judgment. Yet this principle extends far beyond formal adversarial settings into the subtle competitions of everyday life. The employee who shows obvious jealousy when a colleague receives recognition provides that colleague with information about how to maintain their advantage. The parent who reveals frustration during a custody dispute gives the other parent insights into which pressure points might be most effective in future conflicts. The student who displays anxiety about grades gives professors unconscious signals about how much pressure they can apply. The distinction between authentic emotion and strategic emotional display is crucial here. Machiavelli was not advocating for becoming an emotionless automaton, but rather for understanding that emotional authenticity has its place and time. The same person might be completely open about their fears with a trusted friend while maintaining perfect composure when facing a hostile board of directors. This emotional discipline requires significant psychological sophistication. It means developing the ability to feel emotions fully while controlling their expression. It means understanding the difference between suppression, which involves pushing emotions down and often leads to psychological problems, and regulation, which involves experiencing emotions while choosing how to express them. Professional poker players exemplify this skill in its purest form. They may feel excitement about a strong hand or disappointment about poor cards, but their facial expressions and body language reveal nothing to opponents who would use that information against them. Similarly, effective leaders learn to experience the full range of human emotions while presenting only those emotional displays that serve their strategic objectives. The timing of emotional revelation also matters tremendously. Showing vulnerability after establishing a position of strength can humanize leaders and build deeper connections. Showing excitement after securing an advantageous position can be appropriate and even motivating for teams. However, showing these same emotions while the outcome is still in doubt often undermines one's position in the competition. Training in emotional regulation often involves practices borrowed from various disciplines. Meditation and mindfulness practices help develop awareness of emotional states without being overwhelmed by them. Cognitive behavioral techniques help reframe situations to maintain perspective during high-stress interactions. Physical practices like controlled breathing help manage the physiological aspects of strong emotions that might otherwise leak through micro-expressions and body language. The fourth cardinal sin: never admit ignorance on matters of importance. The young scholar sat among the learned men of the university, listening as they debated the finer points of philosophy and governance. When asked for his opinion on a complex matter he had never studied, he had a choice: admit his ignorance and risk being dismissed as unworthy of inclusion in such elevated company, or speak with confidence about principles he understood while carefully avoiding specific claims about details he did not know. His choice in that moment would determine whether he would be invited back to future discussions or relegated to the status of an observer. In environments where expertise and knowledge translate directly into authority and influence, admitting ignorance becomes tantamount to abdication of your position in the hierarchy. Machiavelli understood that perception of competence often matters more than actual competence, particularly in the short term, and that once someone is perceived as unknowledgeable about important matters, rebuilding that reputation becomes exponentially more difficult. This principle conflicts directly with modern educational philosophies that emphasize intellectual humility and the importance of acknowledging the limits of one's knowledge. While these values have merit in learning environments and private reflection, public admissions of ignorance in professional or political contexts often have devastating consequences for credibility and influence. The boardroom provides countless examples of this dynamic. When a director admits complete unfamiliarity with a crucial aspect of the business during a board meeting, other directors begin questioning whether that person should be making decisions about the company's future. When a consultant confesses ignorance about a key industry trend during a client presentation, the client starts wondering whether they've hired the right firm. When a professor acknowledges complete unfamiliarity with a topic that seems central to their field, students begin questioning the value of the entire curriculum. The key distinction lies in the difference between admitting ignorance and demonstrating learning agility. Effective leaders learn to say, "That's not an area where I have deep expertise, but here's how I would approach understanding it," rather than, "I have no idea about that." They demonstrate intellectual curiosity and problem-solving capability even when acknowledging knowledge gaps. This approach requires developing the skill of connecting unknown specifics to known principles. A business leader who knows nothing about cryptocurrency might still speak intelligently about the general challenges of emerging technologies, regulatory uncertainty, and market adoption patterns. A political candidate who lacks deep knowledge about a particular policy area might still discuss their values and decision-making process for approaching complex issues. The neuroscience of authority and credibility reveals why admissions of ignorance are so damaging to perceived competence. When people hear someone acknowledge ignorance about important matters, it activates cognitive networks associated with uncertainty and risk assessment. The brain begins calculating whether this person can be trusted to make good decisions in other areas where their knowledge might also be incomplete. Professional contexts amplify this effect because hierarchies are often based on presumed expertise. The doctor who admits complete confusion about a patient's symptoms may be demonstrating intellectual honesty, but may also be undermining patient confidence in their medical care. The financial advisor who confesses total ignorance about market conditions may be showing humility, but may also be signaling that clients should find someone else to manage their investments. The art of managing knowledge gaps involves several sophisticated strategies. First, developing genuine expertise in core areas while maintaining awareness of the boundaries of that expertise. Second, learning to redirect conversations toward areas of strength when faced with questions outside one's knowledge base. Third, building networks of advisors and experts who can provide information in areas where your knowledge is limited. Effective practitioners of this principle also master the art of qualified responses. Instead of saying, "I don't know," they might say, "I haven't seen comprehensive data on that specific question, but, based on similar situations, I would expect." This approach demonstrates analytical thinking and relevant experience while avoiding claims of knowledge they don't possess. The timing and context of knowledge admissions also matter significantly. Acknowledging learning needs in private settings or during formal training situations maintains credibility while enabling growth. Making the same admissions during high-stakes public moments can be professionally devastating. This principle extends into personal relationships and social interactions as well. The parent who admits complete confusion about how to handle a child's behavior may be showing honesty, but may also be undermining their authority in ways that make effective parenting more difficult. The friend who acknowledges total ignorance about topics important to their social group may find themselves gradually excluded from conversations and relationships. The fifth cardinal sin: never show desperation or excessive need. The merchant's ships had been lost at sea, his warehouses burned in the recent conflicts, and his creditors were demanding immediate payment. As he walked through the marketplace seeking emergency loans, his desperation was written across his face, evident in his hurried movements and pleading tone. Every person he approached could sense his urgent need, and each one adjusted their terms accordingly, demanding higher interest rates, more collateral, and shorter repayment periods than they would have considered just weeks earlier when he had been negotiating from a position of strength. Desperation transforms any negotiation from a discussion between equals into a predatory relationship where the desperate party becomes prey for those who sense opportunity in another's urgent need. Machiavelli recognized that visible desperation not only weakens your bargaining position but also attracts exactly the kind of people who will exploit that weakness most ruthlessly. This principle operates at multiple psychological levels simultaneously. At the conscious level, people adjust their behavior when they perceive desperation because they understand that desperate people have fewer alternatives and will accept worse terms. At the unconscious level, desperation triggers evolutionary responses related to dominance hierarchies and resource competition, causing others to unconsciously treat the desperate person as lower status and less worthy of respect or fair treatment. Modern research in behavioral economics confirms these ancient observations about desperation and negotiation dynamics. Studies consistently show that negotiators who appear to have urgent needs or limited alternatives achieve worse outcomes than those who project patience and multiple options, even when the underlying circumstances are identical. The mere appearance of desperation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that creates the very disadvantages that desperate people fear. Employment negotiations provide perhaps the most common examples of how desperation destroys bargaining power. The job candidate who communicates urgent financial need typically receives lower salary offers than equally qualified candidates who appear to be considering multiple opportunities. The freelancer who seems desperate for work often gets offered below-market rates and unfavorable contract terms. The business owner who obviously needs to make a deal to avoid bankruptcy finds potential partners demanding terms they would never consider when dealing with someone operating from financial strength. The dating and relationship world offers equally clear illustrations of how desperation repels exactly what the desperate person is seeking. The person who appears overly eager for companionship often drives away potential partners who interpret that eagerness as neediness, instability, or lack of other options. The same person, when genuinely content with their life and open to but not dependent on finding a partner, often becomes much more attractive to others. This creates one of the cruelest paradoxes in human psychology: the more desperately we need something, the less likely we are to obtain it through direct pursuit. The person who desperately needs a job may struggle to find employment while their confident, currently employed friend receives multiple offers. The business that desperately needs customers may struggle to attract them while established businesses have to turn potential clients away. Understanding this paradox requires recognizing the difference between genuine need and the appearance of desperation. Everyone has needs, desires, and urgent circumstances at various times in their lives. The key is maintaining dignity and options, even when those options are limited, and projecting competence and value even when facing difficult circumstances. Effective management of desperation involves several psychological and practical strategies. First, developing genuine alternatives whenever possible, even if those alternatives are not ideal. The job seeker who continues consulting work while looking for permanent employment projects a different energy than someone who is unemployed and running out of savings. Second, focusing on what you bring to any exchange rather than what you need from it. The desperate merchant who emphasizes the quality of his remaining goods and his track record of successful partnerships projects different energy than one who simply pleads for help. The reframing of internal narrative also plays a crucial role. Instead of thinking, "I desperately need this opportunity," effective practitioners learn to think, "I'm evaluating whether this opportunity aligns with my goals." This internal shift changes body language, tone of voice, and negotiation approach in ways that others detect unconsciously. Professional contexts require particularly sophisticated management of desperation. The startup founder seeking investment must project confidence in their venture's potential while acknowledging the realities of needing capital. The consultant seeking new clients must demonstrate value and expertise while building their business. The executive facing budget cuts must maintain authority while dealing with resource constraints. Time management becomes crucial in avoiding the appearance of desperation. Rushed communications, immediate responses to all inquiries, and availability at any time signal that someone has no other options or demands on their time. Strategic delays, selective availability, and measured responses help maintain the impression that someone has multiple priorities and opportunities. The presentation of scarcity versus abundance also matters significantly. Even when resources are limited, focusing on what is available rather than what is lacking changes the entire dynamic of interactions. The entrepreneur who talks about growing their selective client base projects different energy than one who admits they need any client they can find. This principle extends beyond professional contexts into every area where humans interact and exchange value. The parent who shows desperation about their child's behavior often finds that desperation makes the behavior worse, while maintaining calm authority tends to improve situations. The friend who seems desperate for social acceptance often becomes less socially attractive, while those who appear content with their social situation tend to attract more positive attention. The sixth cardinal sin, never display your hand too early. The young prince had prepared meticulously for the crucial negotiation with neighboring kingdoms. He had identified his objectives, gathered intelligence about his counterparts, and developed sophisticated strategies for achieving his goals. However, in his eagerness to demonstrate his wisdom and preparation, he revealed his entire plan during the opening ceremonies, explaining his negotiation strategy, his bottom lines, and his areas of flexibility to anyone who would listen. By the time formal discussions began, his opponents had restructured their own approaches to exploit every weakness he had inadvertently revealed. Strategic timing in the revelation of information, intentions, and capabilities represents one of the most sophisticated aspects of power dynamics. Machiavelli understood that information is power only as long as it remains exclusive, and that premature disclosure of your strategy, resources, or intentions gives opponents the opportunity to develop countermeasures before you can achieve your objectives. This principle operates across multiple domains of human interaction, from business negotiations to personal relationships to political maneuvering. In each context, the person who reveals their position too early sacrifices strategic advantage to opponents who maintain their flexibility by keeping their own positions concealed until the optimal moment for disclosure. Corporate environments provide abundant examples of how premature disclosure destroys strategic advantage. The company that announces its acquisition intentions too early often finds target companies raising their asking prices or competing bidders entering the market. The startup that reveals its innovative technology at industry conferences before securing patents may discover competitors launching similar products with superior marketing and distribution. The executive who announces their intention to leave during early stages of succession planning may find their authority undermined and their transition timeline accelerated beyond their control. Investment and financial markets demonstrate this principle with mathematical precision. The institutional investor who telegraphs their intention to make large purchases or sales often finds the market moving against them before they can complete their transactions. The entrepreneur who reveals their funding needs and timeline too early may find investors using that information to negotiate less favorable terms. The individual trader who discusses their positions and strategies in public forums may discover other traders taking opposing positions designed to profit from their disclosed plans. The psychology underlying this principle involves information asymmetry and strategic advantage. When one party possesses information that others lack, they can make more informed decisions and anticipate opponents' likely responses. Once that information becomes widely available, any strategic advantage disappears, and the formerly informed party must compete on equal terms with everyone else who now possesses the same intelligence. Dating and relationship dynamics illustrate how premature disclosure can undermine romantic success. The person who reveals deep emotional attachment too early may trigger flight responses in potential partners who prefer relationships to develop more gradually. The individual who discloses all their availability and interest immediately may reduce their attractiveness to others who are drawn to some element of challenge or uncertainty in romantic pursuit. Professional relationships demonstrate similar patterns. The job candidate who reveals their salary expectations, alternative opportunities, and decision timeline too early may find employers using that information to structure offers that minimize their compensation and accelerate their decision process. The consultant who explains their entire methodology and recommendations during initial meetings may discover potential clients implementing their advice without hiring them for the full engagement. The art of strategic disclosure involves understanding not just what information to reveal, but when, how, and to whom that revelation should occur. Effective practitioners develop sophisticated mental models of how different types of information will be used by different audiences, and they structure their communications to provide just enough insight to advance their objectives without sacrificing strategic advantage. This requires distinguishing between transparency and strategic stupidity. Modern organizational culture often emphasizes transparency as a universal good, but Machiavellian wisdom recognizes that transparency must be balanced against strategic considerations. The leader who shares all information with all stakeholders at all times may build trust but may also eliminate their ability to navigate complex situations that require careful timing and selective disclosure. Negotiation theory provides frameworks for understanding optimal disclosure strategies. Information should be revealed when it advances your position, when withholding it creates greater risks than disclosure, or when reciprocal disclosure from other parties provides greater value than maintaining secrecy. However, information should be protected when disclosure would allow others to develop countermeasures, when maintaining information asymmetry provides ongoing advantage, or when premature revelation could trigger competitive responses that undermine your objectives. The timing of disclosure also depends on your position of strength relative to other parties. When negotiating from a position of advantage, you may choose to reveal information gradually to maintain pressure and encourage concessions from others. When operating from a weaker position, you may need to maintain information asymmetry as your primary source of leverage until you can improve your circumstances through other means. Personal relationship dynamics require particularly sophisticated disclosure strategies because the stakes involve emotional well-being as well as practical outcomes. The friend who reveals all their personal challenges immediately may overwhelm new relationships, while those who share vulnerabilities gradually as trust develops often build stronger connections. The family member who discloses all their opinions and judgments immediately may damage relationships that could benefit from more gradual and contextual revelation of viewpoints. Professional development also requires strategic thinking about disclosure. The employee who reveals all their career ambitions immediately may find supervisors redirecting opportunities toward others, while those who demonstrate competence first and reveal ambitions strategically often receive more support for their advancement. The entrepreneur who explains their entire business model to potential competitors may discover their markets becoming more crowded, while those who focus public communications on customer benefits rather than operational details often maintain competitive advantages longer. The digital age has complicated disclosure strategies significantly because information shared in any context may become permanently available to audiences far beyond the intended recipients. Social media posts, email communications, and digital documents can be forwarded, screenshot, and archived in ways that transform private communications into public disclosures without the author's consent or knowledge. This environmental change requires developing new disciplines around information management. Effective practitioners in the digital age often assume that any information they share electronically may eventually become public, and they structure their communications accordingly. They separate information that can be safely disclosed publicly from information that should only be shared in face-to-face conversations or through other secure channels. The globalization of business and personal networks also affects disclosure strategies because information shared with trusted contacts in one cultural context may be interpreted and used very differently when it reaches audiences from other cultural backgrounds. What appears to be appropriate transparency in one business culture may be interpreted as strategic weakness or naivety in another cultural context. Conclusion of Part 1: The foundation of invincibility. The ancient marble corridors of power have given way to glass towers and digital networks, but the fundamental principles that Machiavelli observed remain as relevant today as they were 5 centuries ago. The 6 cardinal sins explored in this first section represent the foundational elements of strategic self-presentation that determine whether individuals rise to positions of influence or fall victim to those who understand these principles better. Never showing vulnerabilities openly, never displaying indecision, never revealing true emotions in hostile environments, never admitting ignorance on important matters, never showing desperation, and never displaying your hand too early. These principles form an interconnected system of psychological and strategic discipline that protects individuals from exploitation while building the foundation for genuine authority and influence. Yet understanding these principles intellectually differs dramatically from implementing them under pressure. The transformation from someone who unconsciously violates these principles to someone who embodies them requires sustained practice, self-awareness, and the development of sophisticated emotional and strategic intelligence. The remaining principles in our exploration will build upon this foundation, revealing how mastery of public presentation enables not just survival in competitive environments, but the kind of dominance that makes one truly invincible to external attack. The man who destroys his weak self, the self that reveals vulnerability inappropriately, shows indecision publicly, displays raw emotion to enemies, admits ignorance carelessly, projects desperation, and reveals strategy prematurely, creates in its place a formidable presence that others cannot easily manipulate, predict, or defeat. This transformation represents not the elimination of humanity, but rather its strategic evolution into a form capable of thriving in environments where weakness is punished and strength is rewarded. As we continue our examination of Machiavellian wisdom, we will discover how these foundational principles support more advanced strategies for building unshakable personal authority, managing complex power dynamics, and ultimately achieving the kind of invincibility that comes not from eliminating all weaknesses, but from ensuring that those weaknesses are never weaponized by others against you. The merchant stood in the center of the trading square as his competitor loudly proclaimed him a fraud, accusing him of selling inferior goods at premium prices. The assembled crowd turned their attention to the accused merchant, waiting to see how he would respond. In that crucial moment, he faced a choice that would determine his reputation for years to come: allow his accuser to control the narrative about his character and business practices, or seize control of the conversation and reframe the entire discussion on terms that highlighted his strengths while exposing his competitor's motivations. When others attempt to define your worth, competence, or character in public settings, remaining passive transforms you from a participant in your own story into a victim of someone else's narrative. Machiavelli understood that reputation is both the foundation and the fruit of power, and that allowing others to shape public perception of who you are represents a fundamental abdication of self-sovereignty that inevitably leads to diminished influence and respect. This principle operates through the psychological mechanism of narrative control. Human beings understand themselves and others through stories, and whoever controls the dominant story about a person or situation wields enormous influence over how others respond to that person. When someone attacks your reputation or competence publicly, they are attempting to establish themselves as the narrator of your story, positioning themselves as an authority on your character while reducing you to a character in their narrative. The modern workplace provides countless examples of how this dynamic unfolds. When a colleague publicly questions your competence during a meeting, they are not simply raising a professional concern, they are attempting to establish themselves as someone qualified to judge your work while positioning you as someone whose competence is legitimately questionable. When a competitor publicly criticizes your business practices, they are trying to position themselves as the ethical authority in your industry while casting you as the party with questionable standards. The stakes of these narrative battles extend far beyond immediate professional consequences. Once others succeed in positioning themselves as authorities on your worth or competence, future interactions become structured around their narrative rather than your actual capabilities or achievements. The employee whose competence has been publicly questioned may find their ideas receiving less serious consideration in future meetings, regardless of their actual merit. The business owner whose practices have been publicly criticized may discover potential partners approaching them with suspicion and demanding additional assurances that wouldn't be required from competitors with unblemished reputations. The neuroscience of reputation and social judgment reveals why narrative control is so crucial to maintaining authority. When people hear negative characterizations of someone, their brains automatically begin looking for confirming evidence while becoming less sensitive to disconfirming evidence. This cognitive bias, known as confirmation bias, means that once a negative narrative takes hold, even positive actions may be interpreted in ways that support the negative assessment rather than challenging it. Legal professionals understand this principle with crystalline clarity. Defense attorneys know that once prosecutors succeed in framing their client as a particular type of person, a dangerous criminal, an untrustworthy individual, someone with a pattern of poor judgment, the jury will interpret all subsequent evidence through that lens. Successful defense strategies often focus not just on refuting specific charges, but on establishing alternative narratives about who their client actually is and why the prosecution's characterization is both inaccurate and motivated by factors other than pursuit of justice. Political campaigns demonstrate this principle on a massive scale. When one candidate succeeds in defining their opponent as weak, corrupt, or out of touch with ordinary people, that narrative framework becomes the lens through which voters interpret all subsequent campaign communications. The candidate who allows themselves to be defined by their opponent's messaging often discovers that their policy positions, qualifications, and campaign promises are filtered through the negative narrative their opponent has established. Personal relationships exhibit similar dynamics, though often with more subtle manifestations. When one family member consistently positions another as irresponsible or unreliable in family discussions, other family members may unconsciously begin treating that person as less trustworthy, even in situations where their past behavior doesn't support such treatment. When one friend establishes a narrative about another friend's dating choices or career decisions, the entire social group may begin viewing that person through the lens of their friend's characterization rather than forming independent judgments. The art of maintaining narrative control requires several sophisticated strategies. First, recognizing when someone is attempting to position themselves as an authority on your worth or character, rather than simply expressing a disagreement or raising a legitimate concern. The difference lies in whether the communication focuses on specific actions or behaviors versus broader characterizations of your competence, integrity, or value as a person. Second, responding to narrative attacks requires immediate reframing rather than defensive explanations. When someone publicly questions your competence, explaining why you are actually competent often reinforces their position as someone qualified to judge your abilities. More effective responses involve reframing the entire interaction by questioning their motivations for making such assessments, highlighting their lack of relevant expertise or authority, or redirecting attention to the broader context that makes their characterization inappropriate or self-serving. Third, proactive narrative establishment prevents others from successfully imposing their definitions of your worth. People who consistently communicate their values, achievements, and professional standards in appropriate contexts create established narratives that resist attempts at redefinition. The business owner who regularly discusses their commitment to customer service and quality makes it more difficult for competitors to successfully frame them as someone who cuts corners or prioritizes profits over customer satisfaction. The timing and context of narrative responses also matter tremendously. Immediate responses to public attacks often carry more weight than delayed explanations because they demonstrate confidence and preparedness rather than defensive scrambling. However, responses must be proportionate to the attack and appropriate to the setting. Over-responding to minor criticism can make the criticism appear more serious than it actually was, while under-responding to serious attacks can be interpreted as acknowledgement of their validity. Professional contexts require particularly sophisticated approaches to narrative control because workplace hierarchies and cultural norms constrain the types of responses that are acceptable. Direct confrontation with superiors who attempt to define your worth negatively may be professionally suicidal, requiring more subtle strategies such as demonstrating competence through results, building alliances with other influential colleagues, or documenting performance in ways that create objective records of your contributions. The digital age has complicated narrative control significantly because online communications can reach vast audiences instantly and remain permanently accessible. Social media attacks, negative reviews, and digital criticisms can establish narratives that persist long after the original conflicts have been resolved. This environment requires developing new disciplines around online reputation management, including monitoring digital mentions of your name or business, responding appropriately to online criticism, and proactively building positive digital narratives that can withstand periodic attacks. Cultural differences also affect narrative control strategies because different societies have varying norms about appropriate responses to public criticism. What appears to be confident self-advocacy in one cultural context may be interpreted as arrogant defensiveness in another cultural setting. Global professionals must develop cultural intelligence about how narrative dynamics operate in different societies while maintaining core principles about not allowing others to define their worth without challenge. The eighth cardinal sin: never compromise your core principles for short-term gains. The advisor knelt before the king, presenting an opportunity that could solve the kingdom's immediate financial crisis. All that was required was a small betrayal of their longtime ally, a violation of a treaty that had served them well for decades, and the sacrifice of their reputation for honorable dealing. The short-term benefits were undeniable: the kingdom's treasury would be replenished, their immediate military needs would be met, and their current crisis would be resolved. Yet the advisor also understood that accepting this offer would transform him from a man whose word was his bond into someone who could be bought, traded, and discarded by whoever offered the highest price at any given moment. The temptation to compromise fundamental principles for immediate advantage represents one of the most insidious forms of self-destruction in the pursuit of power. While Machiavelli is often mischaracterized as advocating pure pragmatism without moral constraints, his actual observations about successful leaders revealed that those who maintained core principles while being flexible about tactics tended to achieve more sustainable success than those who abandoned all principles for short-term gains. This principle operates through the mechanism of reputation compound interest. Every decision to uphold your principles in difficult circumstances builds credibility that pays dividends in future interactions. Every compromise of core values for temporary advantage erodes that credibility, making future principled stands less believable and future negotiations more difficult. Like financial compound interest, these effects accelerate over time, creating either virtuous cycles of increasing trustworthiness or vicious cycles of declining credibility. Modern business environments provide countless examples of how this dynamic plays out over extended time periods. The entrepreneur who maintains ethical business practices even when cutting corners could provide competitive advantages builds a reputation that attracts better employees, more loyal customers, and more favorable treatment from regulators and business partners. The executive who refuses to engage in office politics or backstabbing, even when such behavior could accelerate their advancement, often discovers that their reputation for integrity creates opportunities that political maneuvering could never provide. Conversely, professionals who compromise their principles for short-term gains often find that each compromise makes the next one easier and more necessary. The salesperson who lies to customers to close deals may achieve short-term revenue targets but often discovers that their reputation for dishonesty eventually makes it impossible to build the long-term customer relationships that sustain successful careers. The manager who takes credit for subordinates' work may receive immediate recognition but often finds that talented employees refuse to work for them, limiting their long-term advancement potential. The psychology of moral consistency reveals why principle violations are so damaging to long-term success. When people observe someone compromising their stated values for personal gain, they make unconscious predictions about future behavior. If this person will violate their principles when the stakes are relatively low, what will they do when facing truly significant pressures? This psychological assessment affects everything from business partnerships to personal relationships to political support. Investment and financial markets demonstrate this principle with mathematical precision. Companies that maintain consistent ethical standards and business practices typically trade at premium valuations compared to companies with histories of cutting corners or compromising principles for quarterly results. Investors understand that businesses willing to sacrifice long-term reputation for short-term profits represent higher risks for future scandals, regulatory problems, and competitive disadvantages. Political careers provide perhaps the clearest examples of how principle compromises compound over time. Politicians who consistently vote their conscience and maintain clear ideological positions, even when those positions are unpopular, often build loyal followings that sustain them through difficult periods. Politicians who frequently abandon stated principles for political expedience may achieve short-term tactical victories but often discover that voters ultimately distrust leaders who appear to have no firm convictions beyond personal advancement. Yet the application of this principle requires sophisticated judgment about which values represent core principles versus tactical preferences. Effective leaders distinguish between fundamental beliefs that should never be compromised and operational strategies that should be adjusted based on circumstances and new information. The business leader who refuses to engage in fraud or deliberately harm customers while remaining flexible about pricing strategies, marketing approaches, and organizational structures demonstrates appropriate application of this principle. Personal relationships exhibit similar dynamics around principle consistency. People who maintain clear boundaries and values in their relationships, even when maintaining those boundaries creates short-term conflict or disappointment, often build deeper trust and more satisfying long-term connections. Individuals who frequently compromise their stated values to avoid conflict or gain approval may achieve temporary harmony but often find that others lose respect for their authenticity and reliability. The challenge lies in distinguishing between principled flexibility and unprincipled compromise. Principled flexibility involves adapting your methods while maintaining your fundamental values. A business owner might change their pricing strategy based on market conditions while maintaining their commitment to product quality and customer service. An employee might adjust their communication style to work effectively with different colleagues while refusing to participate in gossip or office politics that could harm others. Unprincipled compromise involves abandoning stated values when maintaining them becomes inconvenient or costly. The same business owner who cuts product quality to improve profit margins has crossed the line from strategic adjustment to principle violation. The employee who participates in spreading false rumors about a colleague to improve their own standing has abandoned their integrity for tactical advantage. The identification of core principles requires honest self-reflection about which values are truly fundamental versus which preferences might be culturally conditioned or situationally dependent. Core principles typically involve fundamental beliefs about how people should treat each other, what constitutes honest communication, and what responsibilities we have to those who depend on us. These principles often feel non-negotiable at an emotional level and create significant internal distress when violated. Professional environments often create systematic pressure to compromise principles through organizational cultures that reward results regardless of methods, competitive pressures that make ethical behavior seem like a luxury, and hierarchical structures that punish principled stands when they conflict with management preferences. Navigating these pressures while maintaining integrity requires developing strategies for upholding principles in ways that minimize professional risk. Sometimes this involves finding creative solutions that achieve business objectives while maintaining ethical standards. The salesperson under pressure to inflate product capabilities might develop messaging that highlights genuine product benefits while avoiding misleading claims. The manager pressured to fire an employee for political reasons might instead document performance issues and provide coaching opportunities that either improve performance or create legitimate grounds for termination. Other situations may require choosing principle over short-term advancement while building longer-term strategies for career development. The employee who refuses to participate in unethical behavior might need to develop skills and relationships that make them valuable enough to survive political conflicts. The business owner who maintains ethical standards despite competitive disadvantages might need to find market niches where those standards provide competitive advantages. The communication of principles also affects their protective power. People who clearly articulate their values and the reasoning behind them often find that others respect their consistency even when disagreeing with their specific positions. The manager who explains that they won't take credit for subordinates' work because they believe strong teams require trust and recognition may find that even politically motivated colleagues respect that position and adjust their expectations accordingly. The ninth cardinal sin, never react emotionally to provocations in public. The young duke faced his greatest test as rival nobles gathered in the great hall, each taking turns to question his legitimacy, mock his policies, and challenge his authority through carefully crafted insults designed to provoke an emotional response. They knew that if they could make him lose control in front of the assembled court, they could point to his outburst as evidence that he lacked the temperament necessary for leadership. As the provocations intensified and the assembled nobles watched his every reaction, the duke's future depended entirely on his ability to maintain composure while addressing their challenges with the kind of measured authority that would demonstrate his fitness to rule. Public emotional reactions to provocations represent perhaps the most immediate and visible form of self-destruction available to those seeking to undermine their own authority. Machiavelli observed that enemies often achieve through provocation what they could never accomplish through direct confrontation, transforming composed leaders into reactive individuals who appear unstable, unprofessional, or unfit for positions of responsibility. This principle operates through the mechanism of emotional contagion and social proof. When someone reacts emotionally to provocation, observers unconsciously mirror those emotions and begin questioning whether the emotional response indicates underlying instability or poor judgment. More importantly, the person who successfully provokes the emotional reaction demonstrates higher status and superior emotional control, often achieving their objective of undermining their target's authority even if their original provocation was inappropriate or unprofessional. Modern workplace dynamics provide countless examples of how this mechanism destroys careers and reputations. The executive who loses their temper during a challenging board meeting may find board members questioning their ability to handle stressful situations and manage difficult stakeholders. The manager who responds angrily to criticism from subordinates may discover that their team loses confidence in their leadership and begins discussing their concerns with higher-level management. The entrepreneur who reacts emotionally to investor questions may find funding opportunities disappearing as investors interpret emotional volatility as a risk factor for business success. The neuroscience of emotional regulation reveals why public emotional reactions are so damaging to perceived competence. When people observe someone losing emotional control, it activates brain networks associated with threat detection and risk assessment. The observer's brain begins calculating whether this person represents a reliable ally or a potential source of unpredictable behavior. These unconscious assessments affect everything from business relationships to romantic attraction to political support. Legal proceedings demonstrate this principle with stark clarity. Attorneys know that judges and juries often make decisions based on their assessment of the party's credibility and emotional stability as much as the factual merits of their cases. The plaintiff who maintains composure while describing serious wrongs often appears more credible than someone who becomes emotional while recounting the same events. The defendant who responds calmly to aggressive cross-examination projects innocence and reliability more effectively than someone who becomes defensive or angry when challenged. Political environments amplify the importance of emotional control because public officials operate under constant scrutiny from media, opponents, and constituents who are actively looking for signs of instability or poor judgment. The politician who responds emotionally to criticism or provocation provides opponents with footage that can be used indefinitely to question their temperament and fitness for office. The diplomatic official who loses composure during international negotiations may undermine their nation's position and credibility in ways that affect foreign policy for years. Yet maintaining emotional control under provocation requires understanding the difference between emotional suppression and emotional regulation. Emotional suppression involves pushing feelings down and pretending they don't exist, which often leads to psychological problems and eventually explosive releases that are even more damaging than initial emotional reactions. Emotional regulation involves experiencing emotions fully while choosing how to express them in ways that serve your strategic objectives. The art of emotional regulation under provocation involves several sophisticated techniques. First, recognizing provocations for what they are: attempts to manipulate your emotional state in order to gain strategic advantage. When someone insults you, interrupts you, or challenges your competence in aggressive ways, they are often more interested in triggering an emotional reaction than in engaging with the substance of whatever they claim to be discussing. Second, developing cognitive frameworks that reframe provocations in ways that reduce their emotional impact. Instead of interpreting aggressive behavior as a personal attack that requires defensive responses, effective practitioners learn to view it as information about the provocateur's strategy, emotional state, or desperation. The business competitor who resorts to personal attacks during a negotiation may be revealing their weak bargaining position more than making meaningful statements about your competence. Third, mastering physiological techniques for managing emotional arousal during stressful interactions. Controlled breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, and mindfulness practices help maintain physical calm that supports emotional equilibrium. When your body remains relaxed, it becomes much easier to maintain mental clarity and respond thoughtfully rather than reactively to provocation. The timing and method of responses to provocations also affect their strategic impact. Immediate emotional reactions rarely serve strategic objectives because they are typically defensive and focused on relieving emotional pressure rather than advancing your position. Delayed responses allow time for processing emotions privately and crafting communications that address the substance of issues while demonstrating the kind of measured judgment that builds rather than undermines authority. Sometimes the most powerful response to provocation is no response at all. When someone's behavior is clearly inappropriate or obviously motivated by personal agenda rather than legitimate concerns, acknowledging their provocation may give it more credibility than it deserves. The executive who responds with dignified silence to inappropriate outbursts from subordinates often demonstrates superior authority than someone who engages with every challenge to their position. Other situations require measured responses that address legitimate concerns while refusing to engage with the provocative elements of someone's behavior. The manager facing aggressive criticism might say, "I appreciate your concerns about the project timeline. Let's schedule a meeting to discuss the resource allocation issues you've raised," rather than responding to the aggressive tone or personal implications of the criticism. Professional contexts require particularly sophisticated approaches to managing provocation because workplace hierarchies and cultural norms constrain the types of responses that are appropriate. Responding too aggressively to provocation from superiors can be professionally suicidal, while failing to address provocations from subordinates can undermine authority and team dynamics. The key lies in calibrating responses to maintain appropriate boundaries while demonstrating the kind of emotional stability that builds confidence in your leadership capabilities. Cultural differences also affect how emotional reactions to provocation are interpreted. Some business cultures expect more passionate responses to challenges, while others view any emotional display as unprofessional. Global professionals must develop cultural intelligence about emotional norms while maintaining core principles about not allowing others to manipulate their emotional state for strategic advantage. The digital age has complicated emotional regulation because online communications can be misinterpreted and emotional reactions can be permanently documented and shared with vast audiences. Social media provocations often feel more intense than face-to-face interactions because they lack the moderating influence of physical presence and social context. Developing disciplines around digital emotional regulation, including delay before responding to provocative online communications, has become essential for maintaining professional and personal reputation in networked environments. Training in emotional regulation often draws from practices developed in various high-stress professions. Military training emphasizes maintaining operational effectiveness under extreme psychological pressure. Medical training focuses on making critical decisions while managing the emotional stress of life and death situations. Athletic training develops the ability to perform optimally while facing aggressive competition and hostile audiences. Each of these domains offers techniques that can be adapted for managing emotional provocation in civilian, professional, and personal contexts. The development of emotional regulation skills also requires honest assessment of personal triggers and vulnerabilities. Everyone has topics, behaviors, or types of criticism that are particularly likely to provoke emotional reactions. Identifying these patterns allows for developing specific strategies for managing situations where these triggers are likely to be activated. The business owner who knows they are sensitive to criticism about their technical competence can prepare responses and emotional regulation strategies for situations where that competence might be challenged. The foundation of personal invincibility, integration, and implementation. The 9 cardinal sins that Machiavelli identified represent interconnected elements of a comprehensive system for maintaining authority and influence in competitive environments. Each principle supports and reinforces the others, creating a web of strategic disciplines that, when mastered together, render individuals remarkably difficult to manipulate, undermine, or defeat through external attack. The person who never shows vulnerabilities inappropriately, never displays indecision, never reveals emotions to enemies, never admits ignorance carelessly, never projects desperation, never reveals strategy prematurely, never allows others to define their worth, never compromises core principles for short-term gains, and never reacts emotionally to provocations has systematically eliminated the primary weapons that others use to destroy reputations, undermine authority, and gain advantage in competitive situations. Yet the mastery of these principles requires more than intellectual understanding. It demands the development of sophisticated emotional intelligence, strategic thinking capability, and the kind of self-discipline that allows someone to maintain these standards even under extreme pressure when the costs of maintaining them appear to exceed the benefits. The path toward this mastery begins with honest self-assessment about which of these principles represent current strengths and which represent areas for development. Most people violate several of these principles regularly without recognizing the cumulative damage to their effectiveness and influence. The professional who displays competence and maintains emotional control but regularly shows desperation in negotiations may achieve some success while remaining vulnerable to exploitation by those who recognize and target that specific weakness. Implementation requires systematic practice in low-stakes situations to build the habits and reflexes necessary for maintaining these disciplines under pressure. The person who cannot control emotional reactions during minor conflicts is unlikely to maintain composure during major crises. The individual who reveals strategy prematurely in casual conversations will probably struggle to maintain information discipline during important negotiations. The integration of these principles also requires understanding their hierarchical relationship. Some violations are more immediately damaging than others, and some principles provide foundational support for others. Emotional regulation, for example, supports almost all other aspects of strategic self-presentation because emotional reactivity tends to trigger vulnerability display, indecision, premature revelation of information, and principle compromises. As we move toward our final examination of how these principles create true invincibility, we will explore how their integration transforms not just external perception but internal psychology, creating individuals who possess the kind of unshakable self-confidence that comes from knowing they cannot be easily manipulated or defeated by others because they have systematically eliminated the tools that others typically use to exploit weakness and create advantage. In the depths of winter, when enemies surrounded the city and allies had abandoned their cause, the prince stood before his mirror and saw not the person he had been, but the person he needed to become. The frightened young man who had once wept openly at setbacks, who had shown indecision when action was required, who had revealed his strategies to anyone who would listen, and who had compromised his values whenever pressure mounted, that person had to die for the leader his people needed to survive. This was not a metaphorical death, but a deliberate psychological transformation that would eliminate every weakness that enemies could exploit while preserving every strength that could be developed into unassailable power. The concept of destroying one's weak self represents the most profound level of Machiavellian wisdom, the understanding that true invincibility comes not from eliminating external threats, but from systematically eliminating the internal vulnerabilities that make external attacks possible. When someone has successfully integrated all 9 cardinal principles into their character and behavior, they become remarkably difficult to manipulate, pressure, or defeat because they have eliminated the psychological and strategic tools that others typically use to gain advantage over their opponents. This transformation differs fundamentally from mere behavior modification or public relations management. Surface-level changes in behavior, while useful, remain vulnerable to pressure because they are not supported by corresponding changes in internal psychology. The person who learns to hide their emotions without developing genuine emotional regulation will eventually crack under sufficient stress. The individual who memorizes responses to avoid appearing ignorant without actually developing competence will eventually be exposed when facing situations that require real expertise. True transformation involves rewiring the psychological patterns that create vulnerability in the first place. Instead of learning to hide desperation, the transformed individual develops the kind of abundance mindset and strategic thinking that eliminates desperate situations before they develop. Rather than suppressing emotional reactions to provocations, they develop the cognitive frameworks and emotional intelligence that make provocations ineffective. Instead of memorizing ways to avoid showing ignorance, they develop learning systems and knowledge networks that ensure they possess relevant information when they need it. The neuroscience of invincible character. Modern neuroscience reveals the mechanisms through which sustained practice of Machiavellian principles literally rewires brain structure and function in ways that support unshakable confidence and strategic effectiveness. The neural pathways associated with anxiety, reactivity, and defensive behavior can be weakened through disuse, while pathways associated with strategic thinking, emotional regulation, and confident decision-making can be strengthened through deliberate practice. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and strategic planning, develops greater connectivity and processing power when regularly exercised through complex decision-making and long-term strategic thinking. Individuals who consistently practice thinking several moves ahead in their professional and personal interactions develop enhanced cognitive abilities that make them more effective in competitive situations while reducing their susceptibility to impulsive decisions that create vulnerability. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system responsible for fight or flight responses, becomes less reactive when exposed to manageable stressors in controlled environments. People who regularly practice maintaining composure under pressure develop greater emotional resilience and reduced physiological stress responses to challenging situations. This neurological adaptation makes them less likely to display the kinds of emotional reactions that others can exploit for strategic advantage. The anterior cingulate cortex, involved in conflict monitoring and cognitive control, strengthens through practices that require sustained attention and resistance to immediate impulses. Individuals who consistently choose strategic responses over reactive responses develop enhanced self-control that supports all aspects of Machiavellian principle implementation. This enhanced cognitive control makes it easier to maintain information discipline, emotional regulation, and strategic patience even when facing strong pressures to abandon these disciplines. The default mode network, active during rest and introspection, can be trained to support strategic thinking and scenario planning rather than worry and rumination. People who regularly engage in productive reflection about potential challenges and opportunities develop unconscious strategic intelligence that helps them anticipate and prepare for competitive situations before they become crises. These neurological changes create positive feedback loops that accelerate personal transformation. As someone becomes more emotionally regulated, they make better strategic decisions, which improves their outcomes, which builds confidence, which supports further emotional regulation. As they develop better information discipline, they gain advantages in negotiations and relationships, which improves their position, which makes information discipline easier to maintain in future situations. The psychology of strategic identity formation. The process of destroying weak psychological patterns while building invincible character involves sophisticated identity work that goes far deeper than behavior modification. Identity formation at this level requires understanding the difference between core identity and adaptive strategies, ensuring that the transformation preserves essential aspects of personality while eliminating patterns that create vulnerability. Core identity involves fundamental values, creative capabilities, and relational capacities that define someone's essential character. These elements should be preserved and strengthened during transformation because they provide the foundation for authentic authority and sustainable success. The business leader who values fairness and innovation should integrate these values into their strategic approach rather than abandoning them for short-term tactical advantages. Adaptive strategies involve learned patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that developed in response to past circumstances but may no longer serve current objectives. These patterns often include defensive mechanisms that once provided protection but now create vulnerability in competitive environments. The person who learned to seek approval through excessive accommodation may need to develop new patterns that command respect through confident boundary setting. The identification of core versus adaptive elements requires honest self-examination and often benefits from external perspective through mentoring, coaching, or therapeutic relationships. Many people resist transforming adaptive patterns because they mistake them for core identity, fearing that changing these patterns will eliminate essential aspects of who they are. However, successful transformation typically reveals that eliminating maladaptive patterns allows core strengths to emerge more powerfully. Professional identity formation presents particular challenges because career advancement often requires demonstrating competencies that may not align with natural temperament or past experience. The naturally collaborative person moving into executive leadership may need to develop comfortable authority and decision-making capabilities without abandoning their strength in building consensus. The naturally detail-oriented individual taking on strategic roles may need to develop comfort with ambiguity and high-level thinking without losing their analytical precision. The integration of Machiavellian principles with authentic personality requires finding expression methods that feel genuine while serving strategic objectives. The naturally warm person can maintain their interpersonal strengths while developing disciplined information sharing and emotional boundaries. The naturally analytical individual can leverage their systematic thinking while developing comfort with rapid decision-making and strategic communication. The economics of invincible positioning. Understanding the economic principles that underlie strategic invincibility helps explain why the investment in personal transformation produces such dramatically superior outcomes compared to alternative approaches to achieving security and success. When someone has systematically eliminated their exploitable weaknesses, they transform every competitive interaction from a battle between opponents to a negotiation between parties with different levels of strategic sophistication. The person who never shows desperation, reveals strategy prematurely, or compromises principles for short-term gains operates from a fundamentally different economic position than someone who regularly exhibits these vulnerabilities. They can afford to walk away from unfavorable deals because they are not operating from positions of urgent need. They can maintain favorable terms because other parties cannot pressure them through their weaknesses. They can build long-term relationships because their consistency makes them reliable partners. This economic positioning creates compound advantages that accelerate over time. Each successful interaction builds reputation and relationships that improve the terms of future interactions. Each demonstration of principle and competence attracts higher quality opportunities and partners. Each refusal to accept unfavorable terms establishes expectations that future offers must meet higher standards. The professional who maintains these standards consistently often discovers that others begin competing to work with them rather than requiring them to compete for opportunities. The business owner who demonstrates these characteristics typically finds customers, employees, and partners seeking them out rather than needing to pursue these relationships aggressively. The individual who embodies these principles in personal relationships often attracts friends and romantic partners who appreciate their authenticity and reliability. Conversely, people who regularly violate Machiavellian principles create economic penalties that compound negatively over time. Each display of desperation trains others to offer worse terms in future negotiations. Each principle compromise builds expectations that further compromises will be available under pressure. Each emotional reaction to provocation encourages others to use provocation as a strategic tool in future interactions. These economic dynamics explain why surface-level behavioral changes often fail to produce sustainable improvements in outcomes. If someone learns to hide their desperation without addressing the underlying circumstances that create desperate situations, they may achieve short-term improvements while remaining fundamentally vulnerable to economic pressure. If they develop better emotional control without building genuine confidence and competence, they may avoid immediate embarrassment while failing to build the kind of authority that attracts superior opportunities. The social architecture of unshakable authority, true invincibility, requires understanding how Machiavellian principles affect not just individual psychology and economics, but the entire social architecture surrounding someone's professional and personal relationships. When implemented systematically, these principles transform someone from a participant in existing social hierarchies into someone who creates and influences the hierarchies in which they operate. The person who consistently demonstrates competence without revealing ignorance, maintains emotional control under pressure, and upholds principles even when costly begins attracting others who appreciate these qualities and want to associate with someone who embodies them. These associations create social networks that provide information, opportunities, and support that are not available to people who operate from positions of demonstrated weakness. Leadership emergence in groups often follows patterns that reward individuals who display Machiavellian characteristics even when formal authority structures suggest different outcomes. The team member who never shows desperation, maintains strategic information discipline, and responds thoughtfully to provocations often becomes the informal leader regardless of their official title. The business partner who consistently upholds principles and maintains emotional regulation often becomes the trusted decision-maker even in partnerships with theoretically equal authority distribution. These social dynamics create self-reinforcing cycles where demonstrations of strength attract followers and resources, which provide platforms for further demonstrations of strength, which attract higher quality followers and greater resources. The executive who builds a reputation for principled decision-making and strategic competence often finds talented subordinates seeking to work for them, which improves organizational performance, which enhances their reputation for effectiveness. Family dynamics exhibit similar patterns where the family member who consistently demonstrates emotional regulation, strategic thinking, and principled behavior often becomes the trusted advisor and problem solver for other family members. This position provides influence over family decisions and access to information that wouldn't be available to family members who are perceived as unstable or unreliable. Social media and digital networking environments amplify these effects because online interactions create permanent records of how people respond to various pressures and opportunities. The professional who maintains consistent principles and strategic communication in digital environments builds a public track record that attracts opportunities and relationships from people who have observed their character through their online behavior. However, these social advantages require authentic embodiment of Machiavellian principles rather than superficial performance. People are remarkably skilled at detecting inconsistencies between public presentation and private behavior, and those inconsistencies typically destroy trust more completely than honest acknowledgement of current limitations would have done. The person who projects confidence publicly while making desperate private appeals often loses credibility with both audiences. The spiritual dimensions of strategic transformation. The deepest level of Machiavellian transformation involves what might be called the spiritual dimension of strategic effectiveness, the development of genuine inner security that makes external validation and approval less necessary while paradoxically making someone more attractive to others and more effective in achieving their objectives. This inner security emerges from the confidence that comes with having systematically eliminated exploitable weaknesses. When someone knows they cannot be easily manipulated through their emotions, pressured through their desperation, or undermined through their inconsistencies, they develop a form of psychological freedom that allows them to operate from choice rather than necessity in most situations. This freedom manifests as reduced attachment to specific outcomes combined with increased effectiveness in achieving desired results. The person who doesn't need any particular deal to succeed can negotiate more effectively than someone whose security depends on closing that specific transaction. The individual who doesn't need approval from any specific person can build more authentic relationships than someone whose self-worth depends on universal approval. The paradox of strategic spirituality lies in the fact that caring less about specific outcomes often produces better outcomes, while needing less from others often attracts more positive attention from others. This occurs because reduced attachment allows for clearer strategic thinking uncompromised by emotional needs, while inner security creates the kind of stable presence that others find attractive and reliable. Religious and philosophical traditions across cultures have recognized this principle in various forms. Stoic philosophy emphasized the importance of focusing on what you can control while accepting what you cannot control. Eastern meditation practices develop non-attachment to outcomes while maintaining full engagement with processes. Military and martial arts traditions cultivate the ability to remain calm and strategic under extreme pressure. The integration of these spiritual dimensions with practical strategic effectiveness requires understanding that inner development and outer competence support each other rather than competing for attention and resources. The person who develops genuine emotional regulation and strategic thinking becomes more effective in practical affairs, while success in practical affairs builds confidence that supports further inner development. This integration also requires distinguishing between healthy detachment and harmful disengagement. Healthy detachment involves caring deeply about outcomes while not being dependent on any specific result for your sense of worth or security. Harmful disengagement involves withdrawing from meaningful engagement with important outcomes as a defense against potential disappointment or failure. The practical implementation of total transformation. The journey from vulnerability to invincibility requires systematic implementation strategies that address the integration challenges of transforming multiple aspects of character and behavior simultaneously. Most people who attempt this transformation fail because they either try to change everything at once, which overwhelms their psychological resources, or they focus on surface behaviors without addressing underlying psychological patterns. Effective transformation typically follows a hierarchical approach that builds foundational capabilities before attempting more advanced applications. Emotional regulation provides the foundation for most other Machiavellian principles because emotional reactivity tends to trigger vulnerability displays, poor decision-making, and strategic mistakes. Developing reliable emotional regulation under pressure should typically be the first priority for most people beginning this transformation. Information discipline represents the next level of development because the ability to think strategically about what to reveal, when, and to whom supports all other aspects of strategic behavior. People who cannot maintain appropriate information boundaries will struggle to maintain strategic advantage regardless of their other capabilities. Decision-making confidence builds on emotional regulation and information discipline because decisive behavior requires both the emotional stability to choose directions under uncertainty and the strategic intelligence to make those choices based on relevant rather than irrelevant considerations. Principal consistency represents an advanced capability that requires integration of emotional regulation, strategic thinking, and long-term perspective. People who cannot maintain their values under pressure typically lack one of these foundational elements and need to develop those capabilities before attempting to maintain complex principle-based positions. The implementation process also requires creating practice environments that allow for skill development without catastrophic consequences for mistakes. Professional contexts typically provide limited tolerance for learning through trial and error, making it important to develop capabilities through lower-stakes interactions before applying them in career-critical situations. Personal relationships, community involvement, and recreational activities often provide opportunities for practicing strategic principles with reduced professional risk. The person learning to maintain emotional regulation under provocation might practice these skills during recreational sports or community meetings before applying them during workplace conflicts. Self-monitoring and feedback systems support the development process by providing objective information about progress and areas needing additional attention. Many aspects of strategic behavior occur unconsciously, making external feedback or systematic self-observation necessary for identifying patterns that need modification. Professional coaching, mentoring relationships, and peer feedback groups can provide the external perspective necessary for accurate self-assessment. Video recording of presentations or negotiations can reveal unconscious behaviors that undermine strategic effectiveness. Journaling about strategic interactions can help identify patterns and triggers that affect performance. The integration of power and authenticity. One of the most sophisticated challenges in Machiavellian transformation involves maintaining authentic self-expression while implementing strategic principles that might seem to require artificial or manipulative behavior. The resolution of this apparent conflict lies in understanding that authentic expression and strategic effectiveness operate at different levels of personality and can be integrated rather than requiring choice between them. Authentic expression involves honoring your genuine values, creative capabilities, and relational preferences while implementing those preferences through strategically sophisticated methods. The naturally generous person doesn't need to become stingy to implement Machiavellian principles. They need to become strategically intelligent about how, when, and to whom they express their generosity to maximize its positive impact while avoiding exploitation. The naturally collaborative individual doesn't need to become authoritarian to develop leadership effectiveness. They need to learn how to use collaborative approaches in ways that build rather than undermine their authority and influence. The naturally analytical person doesn't need to become superficial to develop charismatic presence. They need to find ways to express their analytical insights through compelling communication that engages others emotionally as well as intellectually. This integration requires distinguishing between core personality traits and learned behavioral patterns. Core traits represent stable aspects of temperament and cognitive processing that typically remain consistent throughout life and provide the foundation for authentic expression. Learned patterns represent acquired habits of thinking, feeling, and behaving that can be modified without affecting core personality. Many people resist strategic transformation because they mistake learned defensive patterns for core personality traits. The person who believes that excessive accommodation and approval-seeking represent their naturally collaborative personality may resist developing confident boundary setting because they fear losing their essential nature. However, authentic collaboration often requires clear boundaries and confident self-advocacy to prevent relationships from becoming one-sided and ultimately unsustainable. The development of strategic authenticity also requires understanding how different contexts call for different aspects of authentic expression. The parent interacting with their children, the professional presenting to clients, and the friend supporting someone through crisis may need to emphasize different aspects of their authentic personality while maintaining consistency in core values and character. This contextual flexibility represents sophistication rather than manipulation when it serves the genuine needs of different